Just 2 short years ago, Ubisoft's XDefiant was one of the most highly anticipated games in the FPS space. Frequently referred to as the Call of Duty killer, XDefiant seemed to represent everything that fans of the genre had been desperately hoping for. But somehow, the game is now preparing to shut down after barely 12 months on the market. In today's video, we'll try to figure out what caused the potential hit to miss so terribly. This is the story of XDefiant, and this is the story of how not to save a game. For those who are unfamiliar, here's a quick intro to XDefiant. The game was first revealed in 2021, announced as Tom Clancy's XDefiant at that time. Developed by Ubisoft San Francisco, the game was described as a high-octane 6v6 multiplayer first-person shooter, with hero elements in the form of the faction system. The initial reception was pretty negative. Fans didn't understand why this was a Tom Clancy game, as the visual style and gameplay showcased was an extremely different direction for the franchise. The only real connection to Tom Clancy were the faction operators being based on different games in that series, such as The Division, Splinter Cell, and Ghost Recon. The development team took these concerns to heart and went away for a year, coming back in 2022 with a rebrand. The Tom Clancy name would be dropped, with the game now just simply titled XDefiant. XDefiant would still include factions based on the Tom Clancy games, but they would now also be opening it up to other Ubisoft IPs as well, with Far Cry and Watch Dogs. A big moment came for XDefiant in April 2023, when Ubisoft released a closed beta test, open to the public if you could land a code. The primary way to do so was through Twitch drops, a system that grants the viewer a reward if they watch a stream for a set amount of time. This is where our story begins. In the case of XDefiant, a viewer needed to watch a stream for 30 minutes, and they would then gain access to the closed beta. This led a lot of big streamers to hop on XDefiant's beta when it first came out. However, this wasn't just a bunch of streamers trying to farm some extra viewers. Many playing the game were actually extremely complimentary to it, and seemed to be genuinely enjoying it. As more and more of the general public got in, the positive response continued to grow. XDefiant's fast arcade FPS gameplay brought people back to an era of shooters that seemed lost to time. In terms of how the game played, the most obvious comparison was to Call of Duty. The maps, modes, and general feel of the movement and weapons were all very clearly inspired by Activision's franchise. Attempting to compete with a series that has consistently been the best-selling video game of each and every year for the last decade plus is a pretty bold thing to do. But XDefiant seemed like it might actually be in a position to do so. During the beta period, many players felt it was more fun than recent Call of Duty entries, and offered many fan-requested features that Activision was not currently providing. It also helped that some Call of Duty franchise veterans would be working on the game, most notably the game's producer, Mark Rubin, who would quickly become the face of XDefiant. The similarities and connections led many to deem XDefiant as the potential Call of Duty killer. Obviously, that was a bit of an exaggeration, but it did seem reasonable that XDefiant could make some serious noise. In order to understand why so many felt this way, it's important to first reflect on where Call of Duty was at that time. The XDefiant beta just so happened to strike at a perfect time when the Call of Duty series was at an absolute low point. The current yearly release was Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 from Infinity Ward, a game that was panned by the community. MW2 made countless head-scratching decisions that infuriated its player base, such as no map voting, not having red dots on the minimap even if an enemy player was shooting, and of course, the ever-present skill-based matchmaking. To make matters worse, the recently released Warzone 2.0 had also failed to meet fan expectations and was performing significantly worse than its predecessor. By the time the spring of 2023 rolled around, the Call of Duty fanbase was beside themselves, knowing they were stuck with these two games that they didn't even like for several more months. So when XDefiant's closed beta came out, it was a very pleasant surprise. As someone who played XDefiant in this beta stage, I absolutely fell in love with it. It was just so much fun, and felt exactly how I wished modern Call of Duty felt. XDefiant didn't do anything all that new or innovative, they just simply listened to what players had been asking for. With the horrific state of COD, XDefiant was able to use very simple features as selling points. Essentially, every mistake COD had made over the last several years was an immediate bonus for XDefiant. Another thing that stood out to me about the beta was how solid of a state it was in. There were issues, such as the servers being pretty unstable, causing some bad hit registration and desync, but content-wise, the game was impressive. It had a wide range of maps, modes, and weapons, all playable right away. Movement felt good, guns were satisfying to use, and the game was incredibly addictive. I remember not wanting to play anything else while this beta was live. Nothing felt as good to me as XDefiant, and it seemed like most players felt the same. Word of mouth spread incredibly fast, with XDefiant racking up over 1 million players during the beta period. With the poor state of COD and the excitement from the beta, the game had a whole lot of momentum behind it. At that time, they stated a planned release window of sometime in summer 2023, which I thought was perfect. It's the point in the year where most COD players are tired of the current game, but we haven't quite made it to the release of the next one yet. A summer release was the exact time XDefiant could slip in and try to garner some players. With all of these factors at play, I was confident XDefiant would be a success. But then, the problems began. As the months ticked by, we weren't hearing a whole lot of development updates. There was a short open beta in June 2023, which many thought might be a final test before launch. But instead, more time went by without any significant updates. Before you knew it, it was already August, and fans were becoming pretty concerned. It wasn't until the end of that month that we finally got an update from Mark Rubin, where he let fans know that the game was still on track and was in submission while they fixed some bugs. This update seemed to imply that while the game was not going to be totally on time, the wait wouldn't be too much longer. But on September 20th, Mark gave us another update. The game was now in what he called a final submission process, and this would take some time. If the game didn't pass certification, it would not be approved for release, and this would make it impossible to hit their target date. In that case, the game would now hopefully release in October. This was the point when I started to get pretty worried about XDefiant. The optics of releasing in October are a whole lot different than summer. Around that time is when Call of Duty reaches the point of its yearly cycle where fans get really excited and invested in the upcoming game, which typically releases at the beginning of November. And with 2023's Modern Warfare 3, Activision had done some smart things to get fans interested. They were playing on nostalgia by bringing back all of the maps from the original MW2. They would also be restoring many of the features fans had clamored for, such as map voting and red dots. What this meant was that Modern Warfare 3 had, for the moment, taken the spotlight off of XDefiant. Many felt releasing XDefiant in October would be a death sentence, and I tend to agree. We would never find out though, because the delays continued. Every month or so, Mark Rubin would return to Twitter with another update stating new issues had been found and the game wouldn't be ready. Finally, they admitted XDefiant was indefinitely delayed and would no longer be putting a release timeline out there. As we reached the new year, development updates were slow and vague. It wasn't until early May that the game finally received its new official release date of May 21st, 2024. For those keeping track, that was over 1 full year since its closed beta period that had taken the internet by storm. In the gaming industry and the internet in general, a lot can happen in a year's time. Trying to recapture the excitement they had back then was going to be extremely difficult. With that said though, many players, myself included, remained extremely excited to get our hands on XDefiant once again when it officially released. After more delays than I can count, XDefiant finally launched and actually got off to a pretty hot start. The game reportedly gained over 1 million total players in the first 3 hours, and saw 8 million players log in within the first week. Although reception to the game was generally positive, it didn't seem to achieve the same virality as the closed beta. I think there are a few reasons for this that we can begin to get into as I give my own personal thoughts on XDefiant's launch. As someone who had spent countless hours playing the various beta tests, my initial impressions of XDefiant's official release was that it didn't feel all that different from what I had played in the past. For example, all 14 maps released on day 1 had been available since the very first closed beta test. Additionally, every faction in the game had been available since the very first closed beta test. And finally, every weapon in the game had been available since the very first closed beta test, with the exception of the MDR, the single new addition. Don't get me wrong, wrong, this was plenty of day one content for a new live service game, but the fact that so much of it was already present a year earlier left me wondering what exactly the developers had been doing for all that time. If a member of the team was here right now, they would probably say that time was spent on the servers and fixing bugs. And while overall stability was somewhat better than the beta tests, there were still many server issues affecting gameplay. I understand that wanting perfection from day one might be asking a lot, but when you presumably delayed the game an entire year just to address these specific issues, I would have liked to see it be in a better state than it was. Honestly, it left me feeling frustrated that I had waited a year for this game to come out, only for it to seem virtually the same as it was back then. When XDefiant's closed beta test was live, I noted that the game felt really good and could probably stand on its own as an early access release. There would be problems, sure, but it's early access and they could figure it out. If the final release is going to barely differ from the beta test we played a year ago, why not just keep it online in early access? They killed their own momentum by taking the beta offline when they did, and the many delays certainly didn't help. However, even with all of this said, XDefiant was still able to garner a massive audience upon its official release, so they were still in a great position to succeed. Why is it then that the game didn't seem to stick this time around? I think first we need to go back to the Call of Duty comparison. As mentioned previously, many of the fan-requested features XDefiant had promised to bring back were already brought back by Call of Duty themselves with MW3. This meant XDefiant no longer seemed as appealing or necessary. In fact, XDefiant was actually missing some features that they had promised, such as a classic prestige system. They promised this would be in the game, but then it wasn't there at launch. By the time they finally added it with a later update, Classic Prestige had already returned to Call of Duty in Black Ops 6. However, there was one promise XDefiant had made which came true, one that Call of Duty fans had been wanting for years, and that was the lack of skill-based matchmaking. If you play a lot of online multiplayer games, you've no doubt heard of skill-based matchmaking. But for the uninitiated, skill-based matchmaking is a system that determines who gets placed in which matches or lobbies based on their individual skill level. In theory, this system exists to keep matches balanced and fair. They don't want a player who barely knows the game running into a lobby of wannabe pro players. The reasoning for this is that it will help engagement by allowing players of lesser skill to hang around and not become overly frustrated, since that could cause them to stop playing. Skill-based matchmaking is a heavily debated topic, with many players of higher skill levels feeling as though it punishes them by forcing them into constant sweaty lobbies without any chance to breathe or relax. Additionally, one could argue ranked play exists for this very reason, and someone looking to match up with players of their skill level could go there. Despite the constant vitriol towards the system, there is clearly something about it that works. I say this because nearly every multiplayer game you play today has skill-based matchmaking, or at least some variation of it. These companies can see the data. If this system was having a negative effect on player engagement, they would know it and wouldn't use it anymore. The point I'm making is maybe foregoing skill-based matchmaking in XDefiant wasn't such a good idea after all. I can already feel the angry comments forming about this section of the video, so I ask that you try to listen to the argument I'm making. I am not defending skill-based matchmaking or claiming it's good for the overall gameplay experience. I am saying that these companies have the data, and clearly the data supports it, or else they wouldn't be doing it. So while no skill-based matchmaking in XDefiant may have appeased the top 1%, I don't doubt it may have actually driven away some players in the end. Speaking of engagement, another important element that XDefiant missed on was the cosmetics. Once again, some of you are going to roll your eyes and say, who cares about the cosmetics? Well, XDefiant is a free-to-play game, meaning the only way they're going to make any money and be able to support future development is with cosmetics. And on day one, they were pretty terrible. They were all very basic reskins and colors, nothing that would really make you want to pull out a credit card. This leads me to believe that many who played the game in those initial days after launch were not spending money. So while a high player count is great, it doesn't really mean much to Ubisoft if no one is spending. I think there was a real missed opportunity here to do more with the Ubisoft crossover angle of XDefiant. It was extremely half-baked, despite being the only real sense of identity the game had. Honestly, if you didn't tell me this was a Ubisoft crossover game, I probably never would have noticed. We've seen from other multiplayer games how impactful crossover events and skins have become. XDefiant was built around this entire concept, but didn't do anything marketing with it early on, which I think was a huge mistake. So with all of that said, it's clear that XDefiant had quite a few issues at launch, and although we don't know exact player numbers, simply taking a look around social media showed that not many seemed super invested. It wasn't long until reports started coming out with some bad news. Around 3 months after launch, we began to hear rumblings that things weren't going well for XDefiant. Reputable source Tom Henderson at Insider Gaming was the first to bring these concerns to light, stating that the game was on borrowed time. One source claimed the game only had around 20,000 concurrent players, while another insinuated the number was actually much lower. The article claimed XDefiant would need to see an increase in players by the end of Season 3, or Ubisoft may pull the plug. A few more months went by and the rumors persisted that XDefiant was struggling. Eventually, Mark Rubin decided to put out a statement on Twitter. He acknowledged that player numbers were down, which he attributed to a lack of marketing. However, he vehemently denied the rumors of a shutdown, stating that he was actively discussing Season 4 and even Year 2 content plans. I remember when this tweet came out thinking, no game that is actually doing well needs to try and convince people it's doing well. And I think this was a massive roadblock that XDefiant hit. When you gain a reputation as a dead game, it can be really hard to overcome. When there are constant rumors and reports that it has low players or may be shut down, it makes new players less likely to give the game a chance. Who wants to spend time and money on a game when people are telling you it may be going away in a couple months? It's a vicious cycle that countless live service games have faced over the last several years, and it seems XDefiant was the latest victim. In the end, Tom Henderson's reports from August turned out to be 100% true, as in December 2024, it was officially announced that XDefiant would be shutting down at the conclusion of Season 3. Additionally, XDefiant would be delisted and taken fully offline on June 3rd, 2025. So just like that, after barely 1 full year on the market, the game that was once crowned as the Call of Duty killer would be gone forever, as if it never even happened. But before that, XDefiant would have one last content update, and it made the entire situation even more devastating. On December 18th, 2024, XDefiant's final update was released, and it was substantial. Not only would the update include Season 3's content, but they would also be implementing everything they had been working on and planning for future updates as well. This included 3 new factions, most notably the Assassins. There would also be a whopping 13 new maps, with my personal favorite being a map based on Rayman. These inclusions of Assassin's Creed and Rayman were the exact kind of Ubisoft crossovers I was wanting them to add all along, instead of only sticking by the franchises that already centered around guns. Alongside this new content came quality of life updates, as well as new progression and currency systems. It was an incredible update, one that probably could have brought some attention back to XDefiant. Unfortunately, that wasn't going to happen since Ubisoft had already blocked new players from downloading the game. I always found that decision to be extremely strange. It almost felt vindictive, or like Ubisoft was trying to avoid any chance of new players joining the game and making it seem more viable. And that brings me to my last major point of this video. We've talked about all the negatives of XDefiant, but I actually don't think any of those things are the true reason why the game was shut down when it was. I think all of that is due to a completely separate issue entirely, one that is not even the fault of XDefiant itself. It all comes back to the game's publisher. If you've been paying attention to gaming news over the last year or so, then you know Ubisoft has not been in a good place lately. Their quality of releases has been steadily declining, and sales numbers have been dropping too. Many of their recent big releases like Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, Skull and Bones, and Star Wars Outlaws failed to meet expectations, both critically and commercially. This put Ubisoft in a position where they needed to start rethinking some of their business practices. Most notably, they began releasing their games on Steam sooner than before, instead of locking them to the Ubisoft Connect launcher. Star Wars Outlaws was released on Steam much faster than any prior recent Ubisoft title, and they announced that the then upcoming Assassin's Creed Shadows would launch on Steam day one, something they had not done for many years. Clearly, Ubisoft had identified Steam as a revenue driver, and a place that they needed their games to be. Despite this, XDefiant was never released on Steam, still stuck on the Ubisoft launcher. This was the first decision that made me suspicious of Ubisoft's intentions with XDefiant. They openly admitted they needed their games on Steam to succeed, and yet XDefiant was never given that chance. Additionally, I felt Ubisoft cut support for XDefiant surprisingly fast, especially when you look at their history. Ubisoft has not been super successful in the live service genre, but they do have two big ones under their belt with Rainbow Six Siege and For Honor. What I find notable about both of those games is that they started off fairly slow, and it was only after months or even years of consistent updates that a large audience began to form. Ubisoft has a history of supporting their live service products until they can make it work. Why then was XDefiant not given that opportunity, despite up to 8 seasons worth of content already planned and in the works? I think it all comes back to Ubisoft's money problems. Back in 2015, when Siege was first released, Ubisoft was still in the midst of Assassin's Creed's peak popularity, when they were releasing a new entry every single year and watching them fly off the shelves. Other franchises like Far Cry and Just Dance were also doing extremely well for them, with their yearly releases selling millions of copies. Ubisoft had a lot of money coming in, so they could afford to eat the costs of Rainbow Six Siege development while the game was nurtured and grown into the smash hit we know today. But nowadays, things look a whole lot different for them, and with less money to go around, it's harder to justify shoveling resources into a game for the off chance that it may one day gain players. Ubisoft needed quick cash, an immediate hit, and when XDefiant wasn't that, it just wasn't viable to continue. I think that's why you saw the Shutdown timing get expedited so quickly. Mark Rubin claimed the game would be around until at least Season 4. Insider Gaming said they had until Season 3. In the end, Ubisoft announced the shutdown before Season 2 was even complete. And it wasn't enough to drop future support, they immediately blocked any new downloads of the game, so if you weren't already playing, you couldn't even give it a try. It was almost like they wanted to leave no doubt that the game would die off, because if it did get popular later, they couldn't have even afforded to support it. I'm not saying there was some big conspiracy against XDefiant or anything like that. The game made countless mistakes, and to put it bluntly, just wasn't good enough to compete in a market this competitive. But even so, a simple look at Ubisoft's history shows they are typically much more patient with these kinds of games. Unfortunately, XDefiant came out at the worst possible time for Ubisoft, which I think most certainly rushed its demise. As I look back at the story of XDefiant, it's pretty clear to see where things went wrong. These several delays following their massive beta test killed all of their momentum. By the time they were finally able to get the game out the door, their main competitor was in a much better place. And with Call of Duty already bringing back many of the fan-requested features XDefiant had promised, the game didn't seem as novel or exciting anymore. Additionally, the day one experience we got was lacking. There wasn't enough new content or sufficient server updates to justify the time they spent offline. Despite an initial high player count, a lack of player engagement and spending left the game in a bad spot. Combine that with Ubisoft's money problems, and it's really not all too surprising that this game barely lasted 6 months before its shutdown announcement. With all of that said though, I am still sad to see XDefiant go. I'll never forget how fun and refreshing its beta test was, and even though I had many gripes with its final release, it was still a solid time. What hurts the most is to see all of the incredible things the team was cooking up for future seasons. I genuinely think there could have been something here if they had just been given the time. In many ways, XDefiant is a perfect example of everything wrong with the live service model today. There were so many updates in the pipeline that could have drawn in new players, but they had to hold them back for future seasonal releases. In the end, those future seasonal releases never even came. In an alternate reality where XDefiant releases 10 years ago and gets given the same level of support as Ubisoft's past live service games, we might be looking at a totally different outcome. Instead, XDefiant will forever be remembered as the failed Call of Duty killer. I hope you enjoyed this episode of How Not to Save a Game. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, it helps out the channel a ton. And let me know what other games or series you would like to see me cover in the future. Thanks for watching.